Thank you for joining us, as I'm joined by JBS's very own David Harris to discuss Prime Minister of Israel Benjamin Netanyahu's address to a joint session of Congress in the US. And David, that was the fourth time the Israeli premier has had the honor and privilege to do so.
In fact, he now broke a record. Winston Churchill, I think, addressed Congress 3 times. Benjamin Netanyahu, a fourth time. What did you think?
I got to tell you, as an Israeli, beyond politics, because we're so used to dealing with the politics of the matter, this was Israel to me. And it was so moving to see the standing ovation and those cheers as the Prime Minister made his way and started speaking. That touched me very hard, very, very deeply in my heart, about the core friendship, really friendship that exists between the American people and the people of Israel.
Any surprises in the speech?
Well, you tell me, David, as a keen, your keen eye on this matter has always impressed me, and your intimate knowledge of what we're seeing in Washington, D.C.
I have to tell you, it was a very difficult speech to prepare. Given all of the wide differences and all of the politics swirling in Washington,
right.
I have to say, I think he managed to thread the needle very skillfully. He was able to address the left, the Democratic Party, the right, the Republican Party. He touched all the bases. He showed a lot of respect for President Biden. He never forgot President Trump. He did not mention Kamala Harris, but again, perhaps because it's not yet formal, that she will be the candidate, though it's expected. He touched a lot of bases there. There are very few people I know, again, whether one likes him or not, who commands a microphone the way he does. And I mean, he has this remarkable ability to communicate.
One of the things that stood out for me in the speech, and I want you to relate to it, is we're used to diplomatic language, political language. But October 7th was very different from the ordinary political and diplomatic discussions. And the word monsters repeated itself, the word evil. And then what the Prime Minister mentioned is it's not a clash between civilizations, it's barbarism versus civilization. How do you see that?
I think he said, frankly, exactly as it needed to be said. I mean, he pulled no punches. He went after the protesters, saying they are supporting genocide, they are supporting illiberalism, anti-progressivism, homophobia, misogyny. He pointed the finger at Iran, as Avril Haines, the Director of National Intelligence of the United States, had done several weeks ago. I think he was very clear in what he said, and I think what he said, again, the Benjamin Netanyahu I know for 40 years very much sees himself as a student of Churchill. And I think he saw this moment as a Churchillian moment. He said at the very outset, Shahar, we are at a crossroads of history.
Right. A
crossroads of history. And he is determined to be one of those people who not only defines the moment, but prescribes the solution.
You're talking about threading the needle. And it takes me to the point in his speech where he was critical of the American administration, when he quoted Churchill but added the word fast. Give us the tools faster so that we can end it faster. How do you see that element in the speech?
Look, I think what's different here is that unlike 2015, which was his last speech, that was the speech on Iran in which he tried to stop what I believe was the ill-fated Iran deal.
Right.
He got a lot of criticism from Democrats for appearing and for sticking his finger in the eye of Barack Obama. Some people have still not forgiven him for it.
Right.
But the difference between then and now is Israel is literally at war. He cannot come as the Prime Minister of Israel. This is the first time I think he's left Israel, isn't it? Since October the 7th.
Yes, it is.
He cannot come here to sweet talk, to be diplomatic, to be endlessly nuanced. He had to go right for the jugular. And I think he kind of laid it out in that very stark language you talked about, because he has no choice. This is not a time for diplomatic niceties and political games. He said it as he saw it. I think he was as clear as can be, by the way, about the goals.
Right.
About the day after, he began to set forth the vision. People had criticized him for missing the day after vision, and also for linking Israel's war to the West, and particularly to America. We are fighting your war as well as our war, he said more than once, Shahar. This is not just our war 5,000 miles away from the shores of the United States. This is our collective war. Our victory, he said, is your victory.
Your victory.
Which also means, though he didn't say it, our defeat would be your defeat.
Well,
this was a disciple of Winston Churchill trying to reach Churchillian rhetoric in order to make the point in war that it's time for the world to mobilize and to define victory and achieve victory.
You know, you're mentioning 2015, and what's striking for me is to see Iran indeed at the center of 2015 with a clash with President Barack Obama at the time. But here we are, David. We see Iran again, and this time in full display to see the danger, the severe danger that Iran poses to the region and to the United States of America. The Prime Minister mentioned Iran funding the campaign, like you mentioned, against Israel here in the US on college campuses and beyond, inciting that violence. And we see the negative role that Iran plays. But I'm wondering if you're optimistic, David, because as a result of 2015 to a degree, we have seen the emergence of the Abraham Accords and the Arab moderate states coming to Israel to forge that partnership. The Abraham Alliance, the Prime Minister mentioned, future of Gaza under Palestinian civilian rule. Do you harbor some optimism, maybe as a result of this move, this speech, this vision outlined by the Israeli leader right here in the United States? Would you see a move forward in the region vis-a-vis that alliance against Iran or against the negative forces that are undermining the US and the West?
Look, I have to hope so. So I can't just be a detached analyst here, because we all have a stake in the outcome here.
Yes, we do.
And none of us can afford a kind of despair or pessimism.
Right.
So yes, number one, I believe that Israel has shown its ability to restore strength and deterrence after October 7th. Number two, the Abraham Accords have held. We don't spend enough time talking about that, Shahar.
Very true.
6 countries were at peace with Israel on October the 6th, officially. Today, they're still at peace. They're still at peace. So they're also sending a message, because they understand that the Middle East is at that crossroads. And there are essentially 2 roads. The road to expand the Abraham Accords, expand the zone of peace and prosperity and coexistence, or follow the Iranian lead, the lead of the regime, whose tentacles are in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Yemen, in Gaza, and yes, in the West Bank. 2 stark choices. And I think most of the countries you and I know in the Arab world would prefer the first.
Right.
But it requires American leadership. America remains the indispensable player, even as China now tries to broker deals between Hamas and Fatah and tries to engage Saudi Arabia and so forth. We need American leadership, courageous leadership. And we have to understand that Iran only recognizes one thing: strength. Not goodwill, not sentiment, strength.
Not appeasement.
When America shows strength and backbone, Iran gets the message and backs down. And when America turns the cheek, looks the other way, lives in denial, pretends, then Iran feels emboldened. Which way will America go will help answer the question, Shahar, of which way the Middle East will go.
Which is exactly why I want to commend the Prime Minister for, presenting Israel not just as Israel, but also a proud pro-American democracy in the Middle East. We know what the negative forces in the Middle East, headed by Iran and its proxies, are trying to achieve. And the fact that the Prime Minister, by the way, referred to that incredible photo, that incredible incident at UNC Chapel Hill, where the frat boys hoisted the US flag, that image doesn't leave my mind. When they hoist the US flag and they're being pelted by the pro-Hamas side, the mobs, while they do so, such a moment of American pride and such a moment of Israeli pride on Congress, showcasing the alliance between Israel and the US. As they torch US flags in all of the pro-Israel demonstrations, it's being raised alongside the flags of Israel. What a great demonstration, don't you think?
Absolutely, and we ought to remember that of all the Israeli prime ministers going back to David Ben-Gurion, 1948, Benjamin Netanyahu is the most American of them all. He lived in America for many years. He got his bachelor's and master's degree at MIT. He worked for Boston Consulting.
Right.
I mean, to listen to him,
yeah.
You could be listening to a member of Congress from any of the 50 states. His English is brilliant.
Right.
He understands this country. So this is not artificial or contrived pro-Americanness for a speech. This comes from his heart. This comes from his kishkas.
It does.
It comes from lived experience.
You know, it reminds me that at one point somebody jokingly referred to him, if you remember a few years back, as the Republican senator from Jerusalem. Can you think of it?
I think he'd like to revise that to the independent senator.
I agree.
Well, let me ask you, Shahar, was there anything in the speech that you would have done differently if you were a speechwriter in his office?
Well, you know, to me, like you said, Benjamin Netanyahu is a master. In conducting. You know, when I looked at him, I looked at a master in his mastery. He was in his most comfortable environment. He was, as you looked at him and he was at ease, sometimes to a much greater extent than I see him in the Knesset or around the government table in Israel. So I think that he delivered everything that was expected to be delivered, in a way even better than 2015, including his navigation in the quagmire of the political storm that we're witnessing here. And one of the things I love the most, and I want you to comment on this, is the visuals. Such great director who's putting the right stories up front. And I want to specifically relate to the IDF soldiers he brought with him.
Couldn't agree more, but I would have added something.
What would you have added?
At least 1 or 2 female soldiers.
True.
There were 4 extraordinarily heroic soldiers, several of whom paid a physical price, and yet are going back into combat nonetheless. There was the hostage that was released.
Right, Noa Argamani, whose story, you remember that photo of hers on the motorcycle?
I think we all do.
Yep.
And of course, her mother with cancer and her last wish to hug her daughter one last time.
Which, by the way, literally became that last wish because she passed away recently.
Right. While on the other hand, the Almog, who was released, his father died
hours before. Yeah.
From a broken heart.
Right.
So unfortunately, it can work both ways. But I would have added 1 or 2 female soldiers, ideally a female Muslim or a Christian soldier, a Druze. And by the way, not simply for sort of Hollywood marketing, but because this is Israel. This is not looking for one female soldier somewhere in the ranks.
Right, a token.
This is the Israeli army. It's a people's army. And I don't think enough Americans understand, including some members of the House of Representatives who looked a little confused, and we can get into that perhaps. I don't think they fully understand that at the end of the day in this country of 9.5 million people, there's not some professional army that's detached from the rest of the nation.
Right.
These are the people. They are Muslim, they are Christian, they are Jewish, they are black and brown and white, they are gay, they are straight, they are religious, they are secular, they are foreign born, they are native. This is who is defending Israel. And they all have the same stake in the country. And I still think that there are some members of Congress, newer members of Congress perhaps, who don't yet get the script here. They still visualize it as a kind of all-white, male, European dominated country. No way. So I think he went quite far with his 4 soldiers and with Noah, the released hostage. I think he could have gone even further.
You know, you remind me when he mentioned the bravery of those soldiers, and he spoke about the Ethiopian Jewish soldier who ran 8 miles. You know, it took
By the way,
me... Yep.
in the heat. This is in
In the
southern
heat.
Israel.
Yep.
I mean, October, it could easily be well over 100 degrees.
Very true. And that was a red dawn on every level that
And
morning.
this was not a race where at the end of
Right.
the 8 miles he sat down and had a good
Gets a
snooze.
right.
He had a rifle.
Right.
And the fighting began for him.
Right. And, you know, it took me straight back to October 7th because I feel in so many cases that the world has forgotten, that many people have forgotten. I was listening to the general media's news, not what they get right here at JBS, which is a real take on reality. And when they discussed the situation in the Middle East, in Israel and in Gaza, one word was missing, and that word was Hamas. People have turned a blind eye to the suffering of so many innocents on that red dawn, on that horrible morning, when we Israelis, we in the Jewish community, we who stand by truth and justice live with every day, as we remember the victims again, as we listen to the testimonies. Only yesterday, David, there was a testimony released of an Israeli male who attested for the first time in front of camera about his rape by Hamas terrorists. The world has forgotten.
The world has forgotten, but I think what the Prime Minister did so well as well was take on some of these tropes. You know, the notion that Israel eagerly kills civilians. He took it head on. How many nations, I'm paraphrasing of course,
Right.
how many nations have sent millions of text messages, phone calls, leaflets to move people? And he didn't mention who, but he said, and we were told in Rafah that to go in would mean disaster. Who was he being told that by?
Right.
Some people in Washington,
True.
among others. And yet he said, he put it on the table. We went in, we found 1,200 or so terrorists, we took care of them. And when I asked my commander on the ground, what about civilians? With the exception of an accident, which the Prime Minister accepted responsibility for,
Yep.
where were the civilian casualties? Israel had managed to move the civilians against the will of Hamas. He took on the issue of famine. While Rashida Tlaib was shaking her head
Yeah.
with her genocide sign and war criminal sign, he took it straight on. 3,000 calories a day were being provided to every Gaza resident. The issue, however, was not in the transportation of the food. It was in the distribution of the food, which was not in Israel's hands, but in Hamas' hands. He took them on one by one by one. He quoted John Spencer from West Point.
Yeah. You know, you asked me something, if I would add
Yes.
something to the Prime Minister's speech. And I think I would on that point, because there is hunger in Gaza, as was attested to by some of the Israeli hostages who were released. And they attested to the fact that they were given almost no food in the matter of days, barely half a stale pita a day by their tormentors, part of the savagery of Hamas. And I think that, especially as the Prime Minister related to the Bibas family, the 2 redhead children, baby Kfir Bibas and his brother, Yarden, who are still in captivity with their parents, Ariel, along with Yarden, the father, and Shiri, the mother. And I think that it's important to remember not just our hostages there, but the horrible, inhumane conditions in which they're being held by the savages of Hamas. No decent human being can proclaim to be humane or speak on behalf of humanity without mentioning the plight of those people.
I think that's very well said. In fact, as you were speaking now, Shahar, I was just wondering, and this is a very out-of-the-box thought.
Right.
I wonder whether the Prime Minister could have invited Noah, for example, to come to the podium and maybe say a few words. I think that would have been extraordinarily powerful. Again, I don't know the protocol in the Congress.
Yep.
And I'm not taking anything away from the Prime Minister. As we both said, this was a commanding performance.
Right.
It was Churchillian in so many ways.
Yeah.
But I think if we could have heard for even 60 seconds and more than just a thank you to the American people, but just something about what she endured and experienced as a reminder to some of the people who were watching or sitting in that hall that there is a distinction between good and evil.
Yes.
And I fear that for a few people in that hall, that distinction has been blurred.
And one of the most important lessons of October 7th is the ability to call evil by its name, to stand up to it, which is key to its defeat. But David, as a keen actor and observer in the diplomatic and political world, I want to ask your opinion about the Prime Minister's vision for the day after. He used two words, right? Demilitarized, de-radicalized. Say something to that extent of how do you see that vision moving forward?
Well, I can only guess at it, but the demilitarized to me seems a bit more obvious than the de-radicalized. Because if in fact Israel has the full cooperation of Egypt, which is key to the story, and by the way, another reminder that Gaza has two borders, not one border, it has two borders. And the Egyptian border is no less important than the Israeli border. And we know from Rafah that a lot of tunnels with a lot of materiel were going through those from the Egyptian side to the Gaza side.
Well, I hope Rashida is, if you didn't listen to the speech, you listened to David Harris exploring that new geographical boundaries for her.
I'd like to think that she was listening or being open to facts, but she's way beyond that, I fear.
That's true.
She lives in a totally different zone.
That's true.
But if Egypt and Israel can truly come together, and the conversations are ongoing, we know.
Yep.
And
with others.
And with the UAE and other actors
Very true.
who all understand that if Hamas lives to fight another day, it jeopardizes the entire Middle East and their vision, not just Israel's.
And undermines the security of the United States of America as well.
All that. So, yes, I can see at least the theory of demilitarization, how it gets accomplished. The de-radicalization is much harder. It's obviously much harder because you can defeat an army, but how do you defeat an idea or an ideology?
But there you have it. The Prime Minister said a Palestinian civilian rule over Gaza, right? Against all of the detractors who claim that Israel intends to reoccupy, claim the land, and sometimes to a degree even in contrary to some elements within the current Netanyahu government.
Yes,
he was
true.
very frank about this.
But the Western idea is essentially that if you can create a middle class, in this case in Gaza,
right.
If you can create economic stability and prosperity, then you displace ideology and replace it with stability. The ideology is so deeply embedded.
Yes.
It's embedded in the mosque.
Yes.
It's embedded in the media. It's embedded in the madrasas.
In the UNRWA schools.
It's embedded in the UNRWA schools. It's embedded until now, unfortunately, in too many places.
Right.
So how do you remove that? How do you remove that? How do you remove the influence of the Muslim Brotherhood? How do you remove the influence of Qatar-funded ideology in Gaza? Now, in saying it, I'm not saying it's impossible, but I'm simply saying that if the Prime Minister is going to achieve his goals, and I certainly hope he does, the de-radicalization is going to take an awful lot of cooperation inside the Muslim world. Israel, from the outside, as a non-Muslim country, is not going to be able to determine the future direction of Gaza theology and ideology. Certainly not alone.
But David, I think key here is that we start to move in this direction rather than ignore it altogether as we've done. And you yourself on this very channel have spoken with forces within the Muslim world who are willing to move forward in this direction. And we know that they exist.
Long walk begins with first step, we're told in that old Asian proverb. And we have examples. The UAE is a great example of de-radicalization. So here again, the consultations between Israel and those who have a stake in this can be extraordinarily helpful.
The Abraham Alliance.
The Abraham Alliance alongside the Abraham Accords.
even though this was a speech before the joint session of Congress, we still saw a hint of Israeli politics there. And I want to specifically relate to the Prime Minister using the term total victory. Sometimes I feel like he uses it to stick it to his political adversaries, because they made it a whole thing in the Israeli political discussion of total victory. But I must admit, in my opinion, I've seen much more of Israel in his speech rather than Israeli politics, and I wonder if you felt the same.
I felt, I'm a lifelong student of Churchill. And I felt, in part he had an eye on Israeli politics. Of course he did. He's a politician.
Right.
Politics follows him even across the ocean. But a part of him had his eye on history. Churchill was the key figure. Britain stood alone with its dominions from June 1940, when France fell, until June 1941, when Germany turned on the Soviet Union. For 12 months, Britain stood alone. Winston Churchill took office on May 10th, 1940, a month before France fell. And he stood alone until the rest of the world caught up with him. America came out of neutrality. He sees this very much as well. He is the Winston Churchill of today. And while he may stand largely alone, it's only a matter of time before other countries, the United States above all, wake up. In the case of America, it took Pearl Harbor to move us from neutrality to engagement. So I think he sees himself very much in that way, and not only as a retail politician trying to keep a very difficult coalition together.
True. I agree with you. I think that's his vision of himself and his role in history. But to that extent, I want to say, for an Israeli leader at this time, any Israeli leader.
But let me turn and ask you, as an Israeli, this is also about American politics.
Yes.
So I don't know if we have a moment. Let's talk American politics. What did you see in that room, and what did you take away about American politics?
Well, to me, on the American political side, it was striking to see the Republican side milking every possible moment of that opportunity to listen to those values, be reminded of the frat boys, and see, the U.S. in full display. And on the Democratic side, you've seen a lot of people sitting idly by in many moments of the speech where they should have risen. You see, people holding their hands together. And I think that's a political mistake on their end. I just want to say that, to me, as an Israeli looking at this, I was taken by one moment when the Prime Minister of Israel was echoing one of the foundational American values. And that was when he related in the Noah Argamani story of her release to the role of Arnon Zmora of blessed memory, who lost his life in that operation. And that took me to that, American value of we are free because of the brave. And that is really one of the things that tied Israel and the U.S. together for me.
Yeah. And I would only say, again, as a political independent, as a nonpartisan commentator.
Right, as we are here at JBS.
On these issues, what the world saw in that hall was a unified Republican Party.
Yep.
It was totally unified. And we saw a divided Democratic Party, by the way, a number of whom were not even in the hall.
Right.
So how, presumably Kamala Harris, on the assumption that she will be the candidate to succeed Joe Biden,
right,
how she handles this. Can she live with this division within the party, or is she going to establish a unifying vision, and if so, what is it?
But it's not just division on Israel.
We can't pretend that it didn't exist, Shahar.
Right. But also, it's not just division about Israel. I'm just wondering if the camera had been focused on Rashida Tlaib and her extremist, factions, when the Prime Minister praised the United States and the United States' role as a beacon for the entire world, would she clap? Would she rise? Would she express that support? It's anti-Israel.
Your guess is as good as mine, but there was one thing that you and I both saw, that the seats on both sides of her were empty.
Yep.
Meaning, presumably, I don't know, but presumably that no Democrats, even those who had their arms folded, wanted to be caught with her as she was holding her reversible sign. War criminal, genocide. War criminal, genocide. So even they, perhaps the dubious or the skeptical, didn't want to be seated next to her.
Right.
But she's not alone. And again, the question for the party going into an election, what could be a very close election, is which way is the party going to tilt?
Right.
You can't dance at both weddings on these issues.
I can express my hope personally, and I'm sure it's yours as well, that we will all move in a direction that's pro-Israel and pro the United States of America, just like the Prime Minister concluded. And as always, David, it always strikes me at just how little time we have. And it's only when I feel like we're digging into it.
I can't see the clock in this chair.
Well, unfortunately, I do. And I want to take this opportunity to thank you, as always, for your wisdom and for sharing it with us and with our viewers. It's always so enlightening listening to your perspective on historical events, especially as they unfold before our very eyes.
The pleasure is all mine, my dear friend. I'm Yisrael Chai.
And to you, our viewers, I'd like to thank you for tuning in and watching JBS as we continue to provide you the best coverage and the most realistic viewpoint that you will find nowhere else. Thank you all for watching, and we'll see you again soon right here on JBS.